All cities have stories. All cities are places of humanity, of life, work, love, and death. But few cities have experienced quite so many stories in such a short space of time as the Lebanese capital Beirut did between 1975 and 1990. Flicking through the photo album of Beirut during this period, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer poignancy of the images. A newly married couple smiling beside a rudimentary barricade. Children waving through a gaping shell hole in the wall of their home at soldiers parading on the street below. An orchestra performing in no man's land between the lines. Muslim and Christian soldiers gathered around a Christmas tree together, still dressed in battle fatigues. These are images of humanity in the extreme, of human spirit surviving against all odds. Of course, it wasn't always this way. Another image sheds some light on what went before. The image shows a street vendor standing amid rubble. He holds a picture of his own, a poster he has for sale. It's a picture of this very same square taken 30 years previously when the city was thriving, before war and bloodshed brought it to its knees. For a while, Beirut and Lebanon as a whole was viewed as a shining light, an example of how a nation can flourish once freed from the yoke of colonialism. Other nations looked upon Lebanon admiringly, and many looked upon it with envy as its economy went from strength to strength. The expensive hotels along the Corniche in Beirut accommodated business people and pleasure seekers from all over the world, all keen to discover what all the fuss was about. A few short decades later, these same hotels overlooking the glistening Mediterranean would be on the front line, military objectives rather than drivers of a burgeoning tourist economy. By the 1980s, the word Beirut had evolved. It had become a byword for destruction and misery, shorthand for a place you don't want to be. This is staggeringly dismissive and dehumanizing to the people left behind in the city and elsewhere in Lebanon. Throughout the conflict, as we can see in the photos we already mentioned, people retained great pride in their city, in their country, and in their identity. The dignity of Lebanon's people, regardless of background, culture, or religious affiliation, was never extinguished, no matter how hard some tried to do so. It's important to keep this in mind as we chart the rise and fall of Lebanon. Covering 80 years of history in a video like this sometimes involves moving quickly, sacrificing some of the minute detail to keep the bigger picture in view. But as we examine just what happened to Lebanon in the decades following its independence, it's vital that we remember this is a human story, one that impacted and is still impacting the lives of real people. Join us as we go all the way back to 1943 and to the beginning of the Lebanese Republic. As is so often the case in global history, out of conflict and ruin sprang the flower of hope and optimism. In November 1943, the world was in the grips of the greatest struggle ever witnessed by humankind. And yet, Lebanon was hosting its first free elections after centuries of colonial rule. While Allied troops would remain on Lebanese soil for another 3 years, 1943 marked the birth of the new republic, and the famous red and white cedar tree flag would fly for the first time. Violence and dissent was never far away from the political scene. Antun Sadar's rebellion was put down in 1949 and its leader was executed in Beirut that same year. Lebanon had also joined the Arab League's side in its 1948 conflict with Israel. While Lebanon had only committed 436 men to the cause, a tiny fraction of up to the 63,000 Arab League forces, their support proved costly. Still reeling from the financial expense of the war, Lebanon was now flooded with as many as 100,000 Palestinian refugees. Amid allegations of corruption, First President Bashar el-Huri found himself under pressure from a growing alliance of opponents. The new country teetered towards civil conflict, but was saved when the Lebanese military commander, Fuad Shehab, refused to intervene on behalf of the president. El-Huri resigned in 1952, giving way to Kamil Shamoun. The modernizing, westernizing President Shamoun brought prosperity to the country, but his ways clashed with those of the traditionalists who resented Shamoun's foreign-facing outlook. An insurrection against Shamoun in 1958 saw 15,000 American Marines stationed in Lebanon to quell the crisis and resulted in thousands of casualties. But despite this uneasy atmosphere, Lebanon's citizens had a great deal to be happy about. The economy in Lebanon was booming. From 1950 to the end of 1956, the national income grew by more than 50%. Lebanese currency climbed in value, and the state coffers swelled with a growing gold reserve. How was this possible? Back in March 1950, when the customs union between Lebanon and neighboring Syria came to an end, the outlook was bleak for the fledgling country. Economists predicted tough economic times for Lebanon, a small nation with a tiny population and little in the way of natural resources to draw upon. Many foresaw a sheepish return to their neighbors, reaching out to the Syrians and requesting a return to the customs union. This, of course, would have put Syria in the driving seat. Any reunion would have been conducted according to Syria's own terms. But this never happened. A small economic miracle was taking place in the eastern Mediterranean. Aware that Lebanese production wouldn't be enough to meet the country's growing needs, the government allowed imports to skyrocket, increasing by 75% between 1950 and 1956. Rather than destabilizing the economy, however, this seemed to fuel growth. All sectors of the Lebanese economy experienced upticks over this period, contributing to the mood of restrained optimism. The idea of the Merchant Republic was born. Or at least, this idea was revived. Thousands of years earlier, the region that would become Lebanon was known as Phoenicia, and its inhabitants had spread out across the Mediterranean, setting up trade and mercantile networks, growing in wealth and prosperity as a result. Now, the modern Lebanese would do the same thing, emulating their enterprising ancestors. This was in stark contrast to what was going on further east. As colonialism fell apart in the wake of the Second World War, economies began to blossom in East Asia as China and North Vietnam, among other locations, looked toward a more prosperous future. But this prosperity would be built on industry and isolation. Lebanese prosperity would look very different. Rather than restricting their economy, Lebanon was about to liberalize it. Scholars have pointed to the free market values embraced by successive Lebanese governments as a factor behind the country's rapid growth. Lebanon's leaders did not try to implement a planned economy or to structure the country's development. The markets would dictate Lebanon's fate, and its industries would guide it forward. One of the most important of these industries was financial services. In fact, this was arguably the most important, as a flourishing banking sector gave Lebanon a new nickname: Switzerland of the Middle East. The tertiary service economy flourished too, providing Lebanon with a growing middle class with high purchasing power. Things were certainly looking up for the nation, still only a few years old. The mercantile, entrepreneurial spirit might have been part of the identity of this new country in the eastern Mediterranean, but external forces were also shaping its destiny. Western powers began to view Lebanon as a vital bridging point between Western Europe and Asia, and a valuable ally in the Middle East. The United States was obviously very keen to keep Lebanon on its path of democratic growth and liberalization. As we've seen, they sent 15,000 Marines to Lebanon in 1958 to achieve exactly that. This was driven in no small part by the patronizing and prejudiced view of the Middle East. Dark and poor was how some described the region, ignoring the fact that the area had been carved up by colonialism and torn apart by conflicts not of its own making. So, Lebanon, in contrast, represented a shining light in the region. While Syrian Ba'athists preached non-alignment, and as the left-leaning pan-Arab General Nasser in Egypt moved closer to a socialist union between the two countries, Lebanon cast its eyes westwards toward Western values and markets. But it wasn't just Western influences that drove Lebanon's continuing growth. The The so-called dark and poor Middle East had money of its own back. Back in 1938, oil had been struck in the Persian Gulf, and the development of these oil fields began in earnest during the Second World War. Nations such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, itself only a couple of decades older than independent Lebanon, became extremely rich. While the mega surge in oil prices would not begin until the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the increasing global appetite for Gulf crude would make certain areas and certain people very rich indeed. The United States maintained a great deal of control over oil in the Persian Gulf through organizations like Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. But there was still money in the region, and this money depended on the Lebanese banking sector. Even as it struggled with its own political violence and civil turmoil, the Lebanese economy remained relatively stable as the country entered another new decade. Throughout the 1960s, inflation was low while growth stayed high. The Switzerland, or sometimes Paris, of the Middle East tag remained, and foreign organizations looked to Lebanon and its capital, Beirut, as a viable financial center, a base of operation for companies looking to expand internationally. The insurrection of 1958 had alarmed Westerners in general, not just Western governments. While Lebanon had developed a glowing reputation thanks to its economy and liberalism, the idea of an armed conflict made actually taking a holiday there out of the question. This changed somewhat with the emergence of Fouad Shehab, Lebanon's third president after the ousting of Camille Chamoun. Shehab had spent more than 20 years in the French army, reaching the rank of brigadier general with the Free French Forces in the Levant. After independence, Shehab would become a major general in the new Lebanese army and serve as the commander of the Lebanese armed forces. Just as he had done in 1952, Shehab refused to commit his forces to either side during the insurrection of 1958. Instead, he sought to protect Lebanon's governmental and civilian infrastructure and retain some semblance of political balance in the country. This would prove to be a masterstroke. As the insurrection came to an end, it was Shehab who was elected as the next leader. The revolution has no winners and no losers, he would say as he assumed the presidency. In a way, he was right. He continued with the modernization of his predecessor, but he recognized the influence of the traditionalists and various religious groups in the country. Rather than picking a side or enacting a campaign of retribution, Shehab made Lebanon stable once again. It was under Shehab that Lebanon's early prosperity would reach its peak. Without the threat of violence or instability, tourists began to flock to Beirut and elsewhere in the country, further strengthening the economy. Shehab was a reluctant leader. He offered to step down in 1960, but his ministers changed his mind. In 1964, with his presidential term coming to an end, he refused the chance to alter the constitution and remain in office. He announced that he would instead support Charles Helou, who took over an optimistic and relatively peaceful Lebanon later that year. The country had gone from strength to strength under Chamoun, but the second president's handling of domestic issues had brought the Lebanese project dangerously close to failure. Under Shehab, it looked like something new was beginning, a Lebanon that could achieve financial growth along with domestic security and stability. But not everyone could share in this capitalist free market paradise. Domestic production was low and foreign goods changed hands at high prices. The central authorities, unwilling to implement controls and curbs that might stunt growth, did little to change this. Outwardly, Lebanon appeared to be a beacon of hope, a success story in a region of failure and struggle. But inwardly, not everyone was quite so happy about the direction the country was moving in. Shehab had done his best to quell tensions and divisions, but they remained just beneath the surface. As Helou failed to achieve the same moderation and mediation of his predecessor, those tensions would grow, leaving the country dangerously exposed once again. Lebanon had been kept on course, even when all appeared lost. This was thanks to both the ingenuity of Fouad Shehab and to the resilience of the country's financial sector. With Shehab now gone and with that solid financial rock now wavering, the future looked uncertain, and what would come next would be nothing short of disastrous. From the birth of a republic to a flourishing economy, from allegations of corruption and political violence to a stable beacon of hope and prosperity, Lebanon had been on a wild ride in those first couple of decades following World War II. By the mid-1960s, things were looking bright. With Fouad Shechab at the helm, the political and social landscape appeared stable, and with a strong financial sector, the health of the economy was assured. But Shechab had made it clear he would not be sticking around, and that solid financial rock at the heart of everything wasn't quite as dependable as it had first appeared. Youssef Beidas, a relative of the academic Edward Said, had been a banker in his native Jerusalem, but after the War of 1948, he found himself on the move. He settled in Beirut, becoming a money changer in an effort to get his career back on track. It worked. Beidas launched his intra-bank in 1951 and adopted a personal touch to marketing. He could be found in the city's hotel lobbies, personally canvassing for customers among the moneyed men he found there. A decade later, and Intra was an international concern with offices in London, Paris, and New York. It had become the cornerstone of the Lebanese economy and the largest bank in the country. Beidas found himself something of a global celebrity. As Western eyes looked admiringly to Lebanon, Time magazine and other outlets wrote glowingly about the man who had made it happen. However, many believed Intra to be fragile, a one-man operation that will someday find itself overextended, wrote Fortune. The resurgence of West Germany dealt a hammer blow to Intra. As interest rates rose in Western Europe, international clients pulled their money out of Beirut. A review of Intra's books was damning. Its liquidity base was dwindling. Beidas, a Palestinian refugee who had denied loans to Lebanese politicians and boycotted the country's Bankers Association, had few friends in government. He'd been tolerated simply because he was one of the nation's key economic driving forces, and his bank was the holder of 40% of the Lebanese deposits. Now he'd need more than tolerance. He'd need the government to actively bail him out. In desperation, he named Najib Salha chairman and asked Salha to apply for a loan from the government. The loan was denied. The knives were now out for Beidas. His fellow banker, the Banque du Liban's Joseph Orgolion, offered to save the day in exchange for high-value bonds and stocks by way of collateral. He took the collateral but did not uphold his side of the bargain. The crisis at Intra had forced a run on his own bank, and now he would do the same to Beidas, imploring citizens to take their money out of Intra. $70 million was withdrawn on October 14, 1966. Only 330,000 remained in the vaults. With no one now coming to its aid, Intra declared bankruptcy. In November 1967, Beidas was arrested in Switzerland. Efforts were made to extradite him, but he died of cancer in Switzerland the following year, aged 56. It was the end for Beidas, and the end for Lebanon's reputation as a financial center too. The government had written checks for all of the major Lebanese banks except for Intra. The IMF would later state that even a modest advance would have seen Intra ride out the crisis with ease. Whether due to personal vendettas against Youssef Beidas, xenophobia toward Palestinian migrants, or some other reason, the government's inaction brought an end to the Switzerland of the Middle East. As Intra floundered in Lebanon, to the south, conflict and bloodshed was rearing its head once again. In May 1967, the Soviet Union reported to General Nasser in Egypt that Israeli forces were gathering at the Syrian border. The reports would turn out to be false, but Nasser began to mass his troops in response, expelling the United Nations forces and threatening to close the Straits of Tiran at Sharm el-Sheikh. This was something the Israelis simply would not accept. War broke out on June 5th. More than 250,000 Israeli troops went up against more than 450,000 soldiers from the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Iraq. Lebanon's commitment was once again small, only 2 combat aircraft, but the 6-day war that followed would have lasting repercussions across the region. By June 10th, up to 1,000 Israelis lay dead and perhaps as many as 20,000 Arabs. The Egyptian and Syrian UAR had lost the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula to the south, and the Golan Heights in the north. In the east, the West Bank moved from Jordanian hands to Israeli. The Lebanese involvement had been small once again, but another defeat put yet more strain on an economy that really could not bear it. Another influx of Palestinian refugees, this time far greater, added further economic and social pressure within the country. The presence of Palestinians in Lebanon, as well as the country's role in the war, brought the nation into direct conflict with their Israeli neighbors. On December 28, 1968, 3 forces of Israeli commandos landed at Beirut International Airport and fanned out across the tarmac. As they went, they singled out jetliners owned by Arab carriers, rigged them with explosives, and destroyed them. They raked the terminal building with bullets as security guards returned fire with pistols. There were no casualties, but 12 passenger airlines were destroyed along with 2 cargo planes. As if to compound the Lebanese humiliation, one of the commandos, Rafael Eitan, would later say that he walked unimpeded into the terminal building, ordered himself a coffee, drank it, and paid for it in Israeli shekels before leaving. Such was the completeness of the Israeli victory. When conflict flared up once again in 1970, as Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, took on the Jordanian armed forces during Black September, Lebanon did not get involved. But Black September left the PLO without a base, driving them back over the border and into southern Lebanon. Here, they would regroup and continue their fight. The Palestinians had been the nominal allies of the Lebanese for decades, but there was an uneasy relationship between them. Lebanon's social structure had never fully accepted refugees within their borders. Even top bankers like Youssef Beidas had been viewed as outsiders, something that would eventually prove disastrous both for Beidas and for Lebanon itself. But now, Lebanon had more than just a Palestinian population. It had what was essentially a mini-state of Palestinian militants operating within its borders. As the initial attempts to bring the PLO under control threatened to spill over into an all-out civil war, a more peaceful solution was sought. Something that would give Lebanon the stability and security it needed, while keeping the PLO alive and ready to fight another day for Palestine. Nasser had brokered the Cairo Agreement in 1969, which basically gave the PLO control over Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and access to the border with Israel. Back in Lebanon, opponents of the government were enraged. Why should Palestinians come out on top in this agreement? What was Lebanon itself getting out of Cairo? Supporters of Shehab, largely Maronite Christians, were particularly incensed by the concessions. If the Lebanese army weren't going to deal with the PLO, they'd have to do it instead. The Falange militia was formed, a right-wing organization led by the Christian Gemayel family, keen to safeguard order, patriotism, and their religion within the country. By the early 1970s, the Lebanese Golden Age was over. The restraint shown by Shehab, first as commander of the armed forces and then as president, had kept infighting and bloodshed to a minimum. But Shehab was gone. His successor, Helu, had failed to achieve the same unity as he had done, and Lebanon veered dangerously toward chaos. The mix of Maronites and Eastern Orthodox Christians and Sunni and Shia Muslims made it difficult to achieve a unified view of a Lebanese identity. Until 1967, all had been more or less united under the cedar tree flag and its red and white bars of independence and self-determination, but not anymore. The presence of the PLO only made this cocktail of influence and identity all the more volatile. Not everyone had been able to participate in the flourishing economy either. A class structure based on free market economics was always going to be relative. A burgeoning middle class with purchasing power meant there was an underclass without. But at least, when money was flowing into the country, the government could invest in infrastructure. Even if you weren't benefiting directly from high-interest savings accounts, you could live in a safe and well-organized society bolstered by Lebanon's position as a global financial center. The fall of Intra had put an end to that. Now increasingly disenfranchised, some ordinary Lebanese citizens began to look for a new system that would better suit their needs, and some settled on communism. There was now an ideological divide to go along with the religious and ethnic tensions that already existed. This would come into sharp relief in February 1975 when the fishermen of Sidon elected to strike, but not before the PLO had already made significant territorial gains in the country. The PLO had essentially taken over the cities of Sidon and Tyre in the first years of the decade and set up checkpoints on the roads from the south to the capital, Beirut. With their ranks swelled by volunteers coming in from Libya and Algeria at the ports, the PLO pushed home their advantage. They drove into Beirut and took control of the western half of the city. No one was now under any impression that Lebanon was not bitterly divided. The slide toward an all-out civil war seemed inevitable. But the powder keg had still not ignited totally. For that to happen, there would need to be a spark. That spark came not in Beirut, but in Sidon. The striking fishermen had downed tools in protest at the monopolization of fishing off the Lebanese coast. Former President Kamil Shamoun and his National Liberal Party set out to place Lebanese fishing under the control of a single company, essentially squeezing out the people who had worked these waters for generations. Ordinary Lebanese citizens, now waking up to the fact that the dream of economic prosperity and free market capitalism had never actually included them, gave their support to the strikers. The government were now acutely aware of this potential flashpoint. The demonstrations must be stopped. As the authorities attempted to use force to quell the discontent, Union Representative Maruf Saad was shot dead. This was, of course, a tragedy. A demonstration over fishing rights had resulted in a fatal confrontation, a life lost. But to the people of Sidon, of Lebanon, it was something even more than this. Saad had formerly been mayor of Sidon and was an immensely popular figure in the city. This was no longer about fishing or even about economic rights and state monopolization. It was a battle for the soul, the future, and the identity of Lebanon, a country still only 3 decades old. Since its inception in 1943, the Republic of Lebanon had been something of an economic and social miracle. Western eyes looked on admiringly as liberalism and capitalism flourished in the country. But by 1975, the dream that had been Lebanon was dying. The crutches of a strong economy and sound governance under Fuad Shechab had been kicked away. What remained was a bitterly divided nation as ethnic groups, religious affiliations, and political ideologies eyed one another uneasily. The rat-a-tat-tat of PLO machine guns and sniper bullets in Sidon sounded the death rattle of the still young Lebanese Republic. Amid the uncertainty, there was only one thing the population could be sure of. The simmering tensions were about to explode into an all-out civil war. Shechab had strengthened the Lebanese security forces, putting them under centralized control. But without the former president at the helm, these security forces had become increasingly desperate and more likely to use force where Shechab had shown restraint. The election of Sulaiman Frangieh in 1970 had done little to cool the tensions. Attempting to reverse the reforms that Shechab had put in place in the previous decade, Frangieh, who had won the presidency by just a single vote, ended up making an enemy of everyone. Weakened by the PLO, embarrassed by the Cairo Agreement, and further humiliated by the Gemayel clan taking matters into their own hands in the south, Frangieh and his government found themselves isolated. When shots were fired during the February 1975 fishermen's strike in Sidon, killing union leader and former city mayor Maruf Saad, Frangieh likely understood he had lost control completely. By the spring of 1975, the sides drew their battle lines and made ready for the struggle to come. Western Beirut lay in the hands of the Sunni Muslim PLO, while the eastern part of the capital was controlled by Christian militias. In the south, the Christian Maronites continued their sporadic raids against the PLO, who fought back accordingly. Elsewhere, Lebanon's Shia Muslim community, long excluded from Lebanon's financial successes, made their displeasure known. They gravitated toward Arab socialist causes such as the Ba'athist factions in nearby Syria and Iraq. Iranian cleric and politician Musa al-Sadr would form his own group, the Movement of the Dispossessed, or the Amal. This would become a focal point for militant Lebanese Shia Muslims. A range of different groups coalesced to form two vaguely unified opponents. The Christian fundamentalist nationalists of the Lebanese Front, or the LF, made up one side, supported by the Maronite militias, the Army of South Lebanon, and Israel. The Army of Free Lebanon, splitting from Lebanon's regular armed forces, also joined the side of the LF. Other groups were involved too, such as the Tiger Militia, around 500 soldiers under the command of Kamil Shamoun and his National Liberation Party. On the other side was the Lebanese National Movement, or the LNM. While their opponents could rally around the central tenet of Christian nationalism, the LNM were somewhat looser. They were bound together by pan-Arabism, but were largely split by Sunni and Shia divisions and by political affiliations. Some of the LNM were certainly hardcore leftists, while others rejected this standpoint and were motivated instead by ethnic and religious identities. At the head of the complex makeup of the LNM was Kamal Jumblat. A member of Lebanon's Druze minority, Jumblat, his family, and his people found themselves in a precarious position on the eve of war, and so worked hard to form the alliances that might just preserve them. On April 13th, 1975, a Sunday, Pierre Gemayel was in church in Beirut. As one of the leaders of the Maronite militias, Gemayel was a clear target for the LNM. But as a Christian, he refused to ignore the duties of his faith and so went to his place of worship as normal. As Gemayel left the church, gunmen opened fire on him. In a hail of bullets, 4 people fell dead, including 2 members of Gemayel's own militia. Gemayel himself escaped unharmed, vowing vengeance upon the Palestinians in the south of the country. That vengeance came swiftly. Within hours, Phalangists and Shamoun's Tiger militia had set up checkpoints around East Beirut. On the lookout for the perpetrators of the shooting, the militias were jumpy. Just after midday, they spotted a bus returning from a Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine rally. Although the occupants had nothing to do with the attempted assassination, the militias set upon them, trapping them within the maze of alleys around the church and opening fire. At least 27 passengers were killed, or as many as 30 by some estimates. Incensed, PLO militias launched their own counterattack. The LNM, understanding what was now beginning, soon joined them. A seesaw of death and destruction rocked back and forth between East and West Beirut, and the civil war had begun. The horrific beginning to the conflict set the tone for what was to follow. As well as facing off against armed opposition, both sides began a campaign of terror and murder against the civilian population. In May, it was alleged that Christian groups murdered a Palestinian man in the center of Beirut. In response, opposition militias abducted dozens of Christians and took them to a site in Bashura in the Muslim-controlled west of the city. On May 30th, 1975, Black Thursday, between 30 and 50 of these abductees were murdered. Their captors mutilated their genitals and dumped them in a Muslim cemetery close to the Green Line, which separated the east of the city from the west. Then, once again, the killing sparked a tit-for-tat back and forth of violence. Roadblocks were set up and both Muslims and Christians were kidnapped by gunmen. Many were killed and many were released, but with their genitals horrifically mutilated. That autumn, ferocious battles were fought for the Kantari district of Beirut. In October, the fighting drew closer to one of the great symbols of Lebanon's outward-facing optimism, already a distant memory. This symbol was Minet El Hosn, the city's hotel district. A decade before, this would have housed Lebanon's growing collection of tourists who flocked to the Switzerland of the Middle East from around Europe and further afield. Now, it was an objective of strategic and psychological value. The benefit of occupying a multi-story building was not lost on the militias. On October 23rd, the Hawks of Azadanya took control of the Mer Tower, pushing back the Christian phalangists who held it. From here, they had a clear view down onto the Christian residential districts and began hammering these districts with mortar and rocket fire. 3 days later, the hotel district in Kantari was on the front line. The Holiday Inn Beirut on Rue Omar Daouk, the Phoenicia Intercontinental, the Hotel St. George, and the Melkat became prime pieces of military real estate, as did the Palm Beach, Excelsior, Normandy, and Alcazar hotels. The Battle of the Hotels, as it would become known, ebbed and flowed for months. By the time it ended in April of 1976, hundreds had been killed in the fighting. The LNM controlled the district, and the green line between east and west was solidified. The remaining LNM groups in the east were expelled. The war was now a year old, but showed no signs of dying down. 1976 was a year of massacres. On January 4th, Lebanese front militias besieged Tel Al-Zatar refugee camp in Beirut. Over the next 7 months, the LF sought to bleed the camp dry, but eventually their patience ran out. On August 12th, they attacked the camp, slaughtering between 1,500 and 3,000 refugees in the process. On January 18th, Christian Khatib militias, along with the Tiger militia, assaulted the Karantina or quarantine district of Beirut. During and after the fighting, right-wing and Christian groups murdered between 600 and 1,500 Muslims, allegedly raping women and young girls as they went. 2 days after Karantina, the PLO conducted a massacre of their own. They headed south out of Beirut and captured the town of Damour, where phalangists and their families were known to live. Between 150 and 582 people were gunned down. All but 20 of them were likely to have been civilians. Once again, it was reported that rape had been used as a weapon of war. Following the massacre, Damour became a ghost town. The bodies of the dead, including infant children, littered the streets. Their corpses were joined by those of previously deceased residents of the town, their coffins dug up and upended into the dust. After the massacre at Tel Al-Zatar in August, the PLO would rehome some of the displaced refugees in Damour. The election of President Elias Sarkis in May 1976 paved the way for a Syrian invasion in June. Some 12,000 soldiers crossed into Lebanon, swelling to 40,000 after the Arab League gave the go-ahead for an Arab deterrent force to act as peacekeepers. Israel would also become directly involved in October 1976. At the Battle of Aishia, the Israeli Defense Force fired 24 shells at the PLO and communist forces attacking Maronites in the area. The first phase of the war came to an end in 1977. The rudimentary battle lines drawn up in the previous years were now fully militarized borders. Southern Lebanon and West Beirut were under the control of the PLO and LNM, while the LF and their Christian nationalist militias held the north of the country and the east of the capital. But by the end of 1977, around 60,000 people had been killed in the conflict. One of those killed was the Druze LNM commander Kamal Jumblat. On March 16th, his car was hit by a hail of bullets close to the village of Barklin in the Shuf Mountains, the traditional home of the Druze in Lebanon. His assassins were never formally identified. Jumblat's son, Walid, took his place. After a short lull in fighting, the war ratcheted up once again in April 1978. For 100 days, Syrian soldiers rained shells down on East Beirut as President Sarkis protested. An emergency meeting of Arab League states led to Syria's withdrawal in October. With their base of power now relatively secure in the south, the PLO and their Fatah militants turned their attention toward Israel. On March 11, 1978, 11 Fatah men ran amok on the coastal highway close to Tel Aviv, hijacking civilian vehicles and shooting at passerbys. 38 Israeli civilians and 1 IDF soldier were killed, along with 9 of the Palestinians. Israel would not stand for such an outrage. They invaded southern Lebanon 3 days later, capturing and occupying a large swath of Lebanese land. A UN resolution called for their immediate withdrawal, and Israel eventually complied in June of the same year. However, they maintained a 12-mile wide security buffer zone along the border, handing control of this area over to an Israeli-backed militia. In September, the Camp David Accords brought peace between Israel and Egypt. Palestinians in southern Lebanon were appalled and decided to step up their assaults. PLO and Fatah attacks would continue, as would Israeli responses across the border. The disharmony sown by the 100 Days War in 1978 would spill over to other areas of the LF. By July of 1980, Bashir Gemayel was dismayed by the lack of unity among the loose collection of militias who were supposedly on his side. While the LF had initially been more united than the loose collection of Islamic and left-wing ideologies that bound their opponents together, things had changed. In Safra, on July 7th, Gemayel's phalangists turned on Shamon's Tigers militia. 83 people were murdered, including a number of civilians. The LF also had the problem of the Syrians still to deal with. Syrian forces may have been driven out of Beirut, but they were not in a hurry to withdraw from Lebanon altogether. This would leave the border vulnerable and would eliminate Syrian influence in the country. To the east of Beirut, at Zaleh, the Syrian forces attempted to take control, essentially occupying one of the main arterial highways between the east and west, as well as the highway heading out from Beirut to the Syrian capital at Damascus. While confrontations began in December 1980, full-scale fighting would not break out in Zaleh until April the following year. Unwilling to get drawn into bloody urban combat, the Syrian forces attempted to keep the hills surrounding Zaleh, shelling the city and cutting it off from the outside world. For almost 3 months, they tried to lay siege to the city, losing 700 men in the process. In June 1981, Lebanon's own security forces arrived to relieve the Syrians in the hills. No side had achieved a total victory. Neither had destroyed the other, but it was the LF who had the most to cheer about. They had prevented Zaleh from falling to foreign occupation at the cost of 400 of their own men and 200 innocent civilians. Throughout 1981, there was bitter fighting across the Green Line in Beirut, in Baalbek to the north of Zaleh, and Sidon on the coast. There was also increasing Israeli involvement in the first half of this year. Israeli air forces shot down Syrian helicopters and attacked PLO targets to the south. On July 17, 1981, Israeli planes rocked apartment buildings in Beirut, eager to root out the PLO forces based there. It's believed that around 300 civilians perished in the bombings, drawing protests from around the world. An American-brokered ceasefire brought a brief end to the Israeli PLO hostilities, but Israeli President Menachem Begin and his defense minister Ariel Sharon had a plan in place should the ceasefire fall apart. In June of 1982, it did indeed fall apart. Hundreds of miles away in London, PLO agents attempted to assassinate Britain's Israeli ambassador. On June 6, Israel invaded Lebanon. Now Sharon's plan would be enacted. The Israeli troops swiftly advanced 40 kilometers over the border, re-establishing the security zone that held 4 years previously. But they didn't stop there. The plan was to smash the PLO and the up to 18,000 Palestinian fighters out of the country for good. Not only this, but they planned to inflict heavy losses on the Syrians too, pushing the 30,000 Syrian troops still in Lebanon back east and across the border. This meant advancing on the capital, and so advance they did. 1982 was yet another grim summer for West Beirut. If the bombing of the apartment blocks had shaken Israel's reputation on the world stage, then the bombardment of the Lebanese capital that summer rocked it to its very core. Images of death and destruction in West Beirut were beamed around the globe, and the civilian death toll soared. By August, it was all too much for the PLO. Yasser Arafat and his men agreed to leave the city, and an attendant force of French, Italian, and American troops was tasked with escorting the fighters out of the city. Israel had largely got what it wanted from the War of 1982. The PLO had indeed been smashed. Israeli forces controlled large swaths of Lebanon's central highlands, with their Maronite allies in the United Nations administering the areas along the Israeli border. They also had an ally at the head of Lebanon's government, Bashir Gemayel, who was elected during the Israeli operation. The PLO forces had been smashed, but their leaders had been permitted to get away. The PLO would regroup in Tunisia. Israelis had their men in office, but only temporarily. In September of 1982, Gemayel was assassinated only 22 days after his election. They controlled large areas of territory, but the Syrians showed no signs of withdrawal. What's more, they had a new and dangerous enemy ready to fill the vacuum left behind by the PLO, the Iranian-backed Hezbollah, who remain a threat to Israel to this day. A negotiated phase of Israeli withdrawal began in the year following the invasion. The May 17th Agreement of 1983 saw Amin Gemayel, son of Bashir and the new Lebanese president, reach yet another agreement with Israel. Israel would withdraw from the central highlands of the Chuf, the traditional Druze homelands, but would retain control in the south, setting up their positions along the Awali River. With Israeli troops gone, the LF forces and Druze Progressive Socialist Party, or PSP troops, now faced one another down in the highlands. The Mountain War, or the War of the Mountain, would be a particularly brutal chapter of the Lebanese Civil War, with horrific fighting taking place in formidable terrain, often with civilian populations caught right in the middle. Whether or not this was part of Amin Gemayel's plan in brokering the Israeli withdrawal, it's impossible to say, but the results were certainly favorable to the Druze. It took the PSP's military arm, the People's Liberation Army, just a month to gain control over much of the Chuf. The fighting dragged on into February 1984 with enormous civilian loss of life and mass displacement across the highlands, but the military victory belonged to the PSP. Back in Beirut, the western portion of the city was further shattered by a spate of suicide attacks. The bombing of the US embassy killed 63 people, while almost 300 US and French soldiers died in Iranian-backed suicide attacks on the multinational forces Beirut barracks in October 1983. Another US embassy bombing, this time in East Beirut, killed 24 people in September 1984, while the hijacking of an American plane in 1985 led to a 1987 ban on all US flights to and from Lebanon. This ban would remain in place for another 10 years. The Druze PSP victory and a strengthening Amal movement, the left-wing Arab socialist group formed by Musa al-Sadr back in 1975, were now a real threat. The multinational force was under attack and was now feeling the pressure to withdraw. The Israelis had retreated south. Beirut would become the focal point for hostilities once again. The Lebanese army had been struggling to maintain a semblance of control for years, but the actions of Amal during their February 6, 1984 uprising would strike the killing blow. Without many of its Muslim and Druze units who had defected to the other side, the Lebanese army was vulnerable. As the February 6 Intifada unfolded, the Amal won a decisive victory. By the end of March, the Americans had gone, as had the multinational peacekeeper force. The Lebanese Civil War would now enter its drawn-out and bloody final phase as sectarian and ideological infighting ripped it apart. The summer of 1985 marked 9 years since the first Syrian invasion. With the crushing victory of their Amal allies in the Intifada of 1984, the Syrians had renewed hope. They threw their support behind the Amal movement, who now sought to rip out what remained of the PLO presence within Lebanon. The War of the Camps would pit Shia against Sunni and would once again provide the backdrop for sickening atrocities. Massacres took place at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps as Amal militants defeated Palestinian forces and then razed homes to the ground. These were crushing victories for the Amal, but in the south, PLO units had the upper hand. They shelled Amal positions and inflicted heavy casualties, delivering a huge blow to the Shias. Amid the carnage of the War of the Camps, the situation began to deteriorate still further. Pro-Arafat Palestinians turned on their pro-Syrian compatriots. The Amal, driven by Arab socialism, clashed with Hezbollah, who had a more religious affiliation. Amal clashed with their former Druze allies in the PSP-2. And while Syria had backed the left-leaning Amal, they became furious with the more internationalist Communist Action Organization in Lebanon, or OCAL, when it did not help them to decisively defeat Arafat and his PLO. The fractious coalitions were falling apart once again. From the end of the War of the Camps in 1988, right up until the end of the Civil War itself in November 1990, Amal and Hezbollah would be at each other's throats. Known as the War of Brothers, or Harb al-Ikhwa, the grim clash between the former allies would set the tone for Middle Eastern politics to come. Other than having once been on the same side, there was very little that was brotherly about the two combatants. Each occupied very different positions, one motivated by political ideology, the other by religious faith. And crucially, each was backed by a different nation state: Syria for the Amal and Iran for Hezbollah. The conflict effectively became a proxy war between the two nations as they vied for control of an increasingly fractured region. In 1990, just as in 1984, the Lebanese army fought a battle for survival in Beirut. Under Michel Aoun, the army attempted to force the LF, led by this point by Samir Jaija, and now known as the Lebanese Forces rather than the Lebanese Front, out of East Beirut. Despite support from Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Aoun failed. What had been described as the War of Elimination succeeded only in eliminating Aoun himself. He was not helped by the disunity within the army. A faction of the Lebanese army did not support Aoun at all, instead rallying behind Elias Hrowi and his Syrian allies. Aoun's war against his own soldiers would be known as the War of Liberation, the final throes of a brutal conflict that was now 15 years old. Just as elimination had failed, liberation would fail too. The road to peace would now be controlled by the Syrians and their Roryite allies. The conflict was coming to an end, and the true cost and scale of it was only now beginning to emerge. The Beirut of 1990 was almost unrecognizable to that of 1975. People might say that about almost any city, London, Sydney, Paris, but they wouldn't mean it, not literally. For Lebanese people talking about their own capital, they mean it. They really mean it. Beirut was ripped apart by the Civil War, both figuratively and literally. The green line dividing East from West, Christian from Muslim, wasn't there for show. It was a genuine divider that said, here you will be among friends, over there among enemies. Of course, you might simply get shot or shelled or kidnapped on either side of the line, regardless of which group you belong to. The historic old town of Beirut was completely destroyed, wiped out by fighting. And because this fighting continued on and off for 15 years, there was no chance to do any rebuilding. Businesses left and the economy shrank to basically nothing. Civilians who could leave left too. Those who could not stayed behind. Sectarian divisions had been a real issue in Lebanon since the very beginning of the Republic in the 1940s, but until 1975, there was an element of coexisting, of harmony. In the largely Muslim Mount Lebanon Governorate, Christians had existed in large numbers in the south of the region. As many as 55% of people in southern Mount Lebanon were Christian in 1975. In 1991, AGBU magazine wrote that the number had fallen to fewer than 5%. Before the Green Line was drawn and Beirut was split in half, around 35% of the population of West Beirut was Christian. By 1991, this was 5%. As David Zenyan in AGBU magazine writes, this is true across the country, and it's true for Lebanon's Muslims as well. In eastern Beirut suburbs, the population of Muslims fell from 40% to 5%. In urban East Beirut, the pre-war Muslim population of 8% had decreased to less than 1% by the war's end. These huge demographic changes could not be avoided. It's estimated that more than 1.2 million Lebanese citizens were displaced during the conflict. Some were displaced more than once. With their lives uprooted and their homes destroyed, these people had no choice but to form new communities and attempt to forge new lives for themselves. This meant that the human geography of Lebanon in 1990 was radically different from what it had been in 1975. The country had struggled with disharmony and distrust before, but now it was completely divided along ethnic and religious lines. But what about those that didn't make it, the casualties of war? It's difficult to put a definitive number on how many people lost their lives. Amid the chaos and confusion, record keeping often simply was not a priority. However, it is estimated that around 120,000 people were killed in the war and 300,000 were wounded. These numbers are staggering enough, but even more so when we consider the population of Lebanon at the time. According to David Zenyan, these figures translate to 4.5% of the population killed and 11.5% wounded. The Lebanese Civil War lasted for more than a decade and a half. Children born at the conflict's outset were almost adults by the time it reached an end. Entire childhoods, whole sections of people's lives were given up to the war. During this period, society and authority broke down. Lebanon citizens found themselves answering to their own government and armed forces one week and a local militia the next, or perhaps to the soldiers of a foreign power. One such citizen, Dolly, interviewed by the academics Carmen Hassoun Abu Jawoude and Danielle Rugo, described abuses of power and authority by these militia. My father was kidnapped multiple times by the local militia. They used to threaten him if he didn't give them the money they asked for. This, the family said, took a terrible toll on Dolly's father, Habib. It hastened his illness, the onset of his dementia, and his eventual death. Dolly's sister, Gada, had similarly grim memories of life under militia control. The militiamen, some of whom we knew from our village, used to invade my father's store and take food or beverage supplies, then sell them in their so-called cooperative stores and supermarkets, Gada recalled. They robbed people, businesses, and the Beirut port, which was controlled by Christian militias during the war. Gada also shared the story of a friend, Dania, who held an open house following the death of her mother. The event was supposed to be an opportunity for those who wished to offer condolences, but when the militia showed up, they were not there to give, they were there to take. The militiaman stood at the door waiting to collect the money, Gada remembered. My friend refused to pay him. Joe, a teenage employee at a cinema during the war, describes how militiamen would often bully and frighten the local population. He would implore the militiamen to leave their guns in the cloakroom with a ticket so they could pick up the weapon upon leaving. It didn't always work. Fahed, another employee, remembered how the militiamen started shooting in the air inside the cinema to frighten and intimidate people. Once, a screening of a film was interrupted, he said, as armed men ordered people from the audience to help fill sandbags in anticipation of a battle. Across the country, spaces that had been places of work, leisure, residence, and governance were transformed into those of bloodshed and horror. In her book, Wars Are the Voices, Miriam Cook describes a secretary who drove her car into West Beirut's French embassy compound one May morning at 8:05 a.m. This was an everyday action, something that would not be out of place in any city in the world. Only this was not any city in the world. It was Beirut, and the year was 1982. At the touch of a button, the car exploded, ripping the vehicle and its driver apart. Those standing in line to apply for visas that morning were ripped apart too, as were the guards at the gateway. Guts and entrails were spread across the neighborhood. A few days later, a hand was found in a flower pot nearby. It was still clutching a cigarette. Lina Miqdadi Tabara would use the chaos and horror of the conflict as inspiration for her novel Survival in Beirut, penned in 1978. Or maybe it wasn't mere inspiration. Perhaps writing the novel was something of a coping mechanism. While the book is a work of fiction, it seems likely that Tabara drew upon some of her own experiences as she wrote. In one passage, she talks of confusion at personal faith and response to terror and danger. Tabara's character, from an Islamic background but not typically a practicing Muslim herself, describes being so shaken that I, who don't believe in anything, surprised myself by starting to pray between 2 swallows of cognac, cause enough to upset the Prophet who has forbidden his followers alcohol. With such division and with such trauma on a personal and national level, Lebanon was in a desperate position. Still less than half a century old, the Republic of Lebanon had undergone a millennium's worth of horror in just a few decades. Now, the war was over, but such things don't simply end, not like that. A conflict that had drilled deep down into the very heart of the country, then ripped that heart out, cannot be turned off like a light switch. The slow process of reconciliation and rehabilitation, or reconstruction and reform, must now begin. And in such a divided nation, this would need to be handled with enormous care. Violence was still a very real possibility. The civil war that had ravaged Lebanon for 15 years came to an end in 1990. Peace was declared. Perhaps this is where the story ends. If this were a Hollywood movie, maybe it would be. There would be a hero and a happy ending, and there would be a neat and tidy conclusion to the whole thing. But this isn't a Hollywood movie. Instead, this is real life and real conflict, and such things are never neat and tidy. After 15 plus years of bloodshed and conflict, reconstruction and reconciliation must now take place. But with wounds still open and gaping, with traumas still unhealed, this isn't going to be easy. First of all, what are we dealing with here? What was the situation in Lebanon at the end of the war? The first meaningful movements toward peace had begun in 1989, as Lebanon's Speaker of the Parliament, Hussein el-Husseini, sought to bring about the end of the conflict with a national reconciliation accord. Members of the 1972 Lebanese Parliament, who had survived the last 14 years of war, met in Taif, Saudi Arabia, to negotiate the accord. The result was the Taif Agreement, a roadmap that could bring Lebanon to peace and to rebuilding. But almost as soon as the agreement was finalized on October 22, 1989, moves toward peace were thrown into disarray. Following the end of Amin Jamal's presidential term in 1988, the position had been left vacant. On November 5, 1989, René Mouawad was elected as Jamal's successor, and the Taif Agreement was ratified by Parliament that same day. On November 22nd, a car bombing took the president's life and those of 23 others. No one has ever claimed responsibility for the bombing, and no formal investigation ever took place. It was against this uneasy backdrop that Elias Harawi took office as Lebanon's 10th president only 2 days after the assassination of his predecessor. Harawi had the backing of Syria. He had a substantial chunk of Lebanon's armed forces still loyal to him, and he was going to end the war and enact the Taif Agreement. With the defeat of Michel Aoun's faction of the Lebanese army and Samir Jarjar's Lebanese forces in 1990, Harawi did exactly that. In September 1990, the Taif Agreement was signed into law, bringing about a number of political and constitutional changes. These changes included more equal representation in parliament, with parliament split 50-50 between Muslim and Christian members. Executive power was also transferred from the President of the Republic to the Council of Ministers. A number of other presidential powers were either reduced or removed as Lebanon attempted to move toward a more stable and representative form of governance. Perhaps the most profound provisions of the agreement, however, involved the militias and the Syrian troops that still occupied large swaths of territory. The militias were given a deadline of April 30th, 1991, by which they had to surrender their territory and heavy weapons and disband. This included the militias that had fought on the side of Harawi and the Syrians, as well as those who had fought against. To ease this process, an amnesty was declared. The majority of political crimes that took place before the signing of the agreement would be pardoned. Perhaps encouraged by the knowledge of almost impunity, most militia groups complied with the deadline, and by May 1991, the Lebanese armed forces were in control of most of the country. Hezbollah, it's important to note, did not comply. Attacks continued, including one that wounded Minister Rafic Hariri in Beirut in December 1991, although this was never formally linked to Hezbollah. There was another deadline built into the Taif Agreement. By September 1992, the Syrian army was supposed to begin its withdrawal, giving over occupied territory to Lebanese control. However, the wording left open a loophole for the Syrians to stay with Lebanese approval. The Syrian army complied to some extent, reducing their forces in Lebanon by about 20,000, down to between 14,000 and 15,000. But no timeline was given for their withdrawal from the Bekaa Valley. While Israeli troops remained in the south of Lebanon, Syria was in no hurry to leave the territory it occupied in the east. Although occupying forces remained in large areas of the country and Hezbollah continued its policy of non-compliance, there were attempts to return Lebanon to some semblance of normality. Maybe, just maybe, after so many years of trauma, Lebanon could begin its road to recovery. And from here, perhaps it could regain some of the glories it had enjoyed back in the 1960s, glories that now seemed impossibly far away. For this, Hariri recruited Rafic Hariri. Hariri was no stranger to Lebanese politics or commerce. A Sunni Muslim from Sidon, he'd studied business administration at Beirut Arab University before pursuing a career in construction in Saudi Arabia. After some setbacks, he finally made his fortune with a series of royal contracts. He returned to Lebanon a billionaire, and as his country ailed, he set about doing what he could to support his people. He built schools and educational facilities, and he founded the Hariri Foundation, even as the nation fell into civil war. He donated $12 million to help the victims of the Israeli invasion of 1978, and spent money freely as the conflict dragged on into the 1980s. But not everyone viewed him as a benign philanthropist. Hariri was accused of profiteering, financing the militias destroying Beirut only to rebuild it with his own projects. Whether or not this is true, it seems Hariri was, at least, one of the architects of the Taif Accord, which was negotiated in the very Saudi city where Hariri had built his first hotel decades previously. This was the man, Hariri decided, who would become his first prime minister of the new Lebanese Republic, as well as his minister of finance. Of course, in accordance with Taif, this was agreed upon by parliament. So Hariri got to work. He issued Eurobonds, or bonds based on foreign currencies, effectively borrowing the funds his country needed for reconstruction. The World Bank was overjoyed at this, praising Hariri for his ingenuity, and rebuilding went ahead as planned. Once again, Lebanon embraced the private sector. A real estate company, Solidaire, set about reversing the damage that had ravaged central Beirut for the last decade and a half. Lebanon was slowly emerging from the ashes. With Solidaire rebuilding the capital, Lebanon was once again looking west. The company took inspiration from Western urban regeneration projects, developing infrastructure whilst bolstering the private sector by selling off development rights. Offices and apartments transformed the Beirut skyline, while the traditional souks and blocks of the pre-war city were erased from the map. The development was, of course, not without its critics. While the reconstruction of areas such as Zokak el-Blatz supposedly weakened Hezbollah by removing much of its influence in the city, some believed it was sowing dangerous inequalities. Just like in the 1960s, a new Lebanese dream was blossoming. But it was a dream that not everyone could participate in. Driven by market forces rather than by public need, the redevelopment prioritized the interests of investors and shareholders. Beirut's ordinary citizens, many of whom had lived in the city for generations, even while bombs and rockets ripped it apart, were being priced out. For researchers Bruno Marot and Serge Yazigi, writing for the Metropolitic Journal in 2012, this brought Lebanon dangerously close to the levels of inequality that had helped spark the conflict in the first place. And of course, the redevelopment was not free. Hariri's monetary policies sent the national debt into spiral. In 1993, Lebanon's gross debt was $4.2 billion. Within 2 years, this had more than doubled, reaching $9.3 billion in 1995. By 1998, it had doubled again to $18.6 billion. Hariri had drawn plaudits from the World Bank for his approach to reconstruction. Even with the weight of debt now hanging over the country, few could argue with the facts on the ground. Highways were being built, schools and educational institutions too, an airport, energy infrastructure. Was the debt simply a sad fact of life on Lebanon's reconstructive journey, or was it a sign of something more sinister? Fabrice Balanche's 2021 paper on the Reconstruction of Lebanon agrees with the work of Marot and Yazigi. Hariri, Solidaire, and a liberal approach to capitalism did indeed get certain jobs done, and did indeed increase division and inequality in the country. Balanche's paper also outlines other issues with this infrastructure. In many cases, construction projects were paid for with an alarming amount of public money, often far beyond the actual cost of the construction itself. The additional capital was siphoned off by rival politicians who sent their own contractors to handle the construction and gave their political allegiances to Hariri. Hariri's own contractors sometimes handled the work themselves, but this made little difference to the bloated costs. Allegations of corruption, of theft from Lebanese coffers and for the nation's people were inevitable. In the south, the question of Hezbollah remained. The group was still armed, still ready to act in the furthering of its cause. But it was changing. During the war, Hezbollah had attempted to form a territory of its own, a state within a state. It protected its supporters, offering social services at a time when many other Lebanese citizens were denied such things. After the war, the group maintained its opposition to Israel and its support for Iran, but it abandoned the idea of an Islamic Lebanese Republic. Perhaps motivated by pragmatism and realism, or maybe recognizing the fact that non-Muslim Lebanese citizens deserved to feel safe and at home in their country too, Hezbollah became more focused on unifying the country with representative government. But this softened approach did not mean that violence was off the table. In 2004, Hariri's final term as Prime Minister came to an end. He entered opposition and was a lively critic of the Syrian armed forces who had still not fully withdrawn from his country. His position on Syria had its supporters, but it had its critics too, some of whom were heavily armed and highly dangerous. Hezbollah, which had seemingly forgotten its war against the pro-Syrian Amal movement back in 1989, came out on the side of the Syrians. Having enemies was nothing new for Hariri, but Hezbollah had both the motive and the means to make good on their threats. Valentine's Day, 2005. A motorcade leaves Beirut's Café de l'Étoile. Inside one of the cars is Rafic Hariri, as well as his former economy minister Bassel Fleihan. As the group passed along Beirut's seafront corniche, Hariri may have gazed upon the infrastructure and redevelopment that his tenure helped to bring about. Or he may simply not have noticed it, having passed this way many times before. Outside the St. George Hotel, an enormous blast rips through the air. Blackened rubble and debris litter the scene. Thick smoke climbs into the February sky. Hariri and Fleihan are dead, along with 20 others, mainly bodyguards and passers-by, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hariri was a polarizing figure. To some, he was a patriot and a hero, an architect of Lebanon's road to peace and then to rehabilitation. To others, he was a hawk, a profiteer, a racketeer, looking to line his own pockets while his compatriots suffered. To most, however, he was somewhere in between, self-interest and national interest wrestling for control of the man's motivation at any given moment of time. In death, as in life, he cast a long shadow over Lebanon. His actions over the previous 15 years since the end of the war had shown that it was possible for Lebanon to regain some of its past glory. And it had also exposed the holes in this glory. The storm of private investment, political profit, and spiraling debt had proved that not everyone could be permitted a share in the good times. And his assassination. Well, that had demonstrated that violence could and would be part of Lebanon's social and political landscape. The war had begun to feel like a distant memory for many Lebanese. The murder of Rafic Hariri underlined the truth. The memory wasn't all that distant. The Republic of Lebanon had been built on a vision of hope and optimism. At the heart of this vision was ethnic and religious diversity. With so many different groups calling Lebanon their home and new groups arriving as refugees following regional conflicts, diversity and the way it was managed was always going to play a big role in the direction of the country. But there was something else at the heart of this vision too: private business. In those early years, Lebanon surged forward on a wave of free market capitalism, emulating the ancient Phoenicians who set forth from the eastern Mediterranean and made their fortunes in the ports and trading posts of the classical world. So after civil war ripped through the country from 1975 to 1990, and the time came to rebuild, it made sense that diversity and finance would form the foundations once again. A newly representative government, as outlined in the Taif Agreement that ended the war, sought to make Lebanon a more balanced nation. Meanwhile, the government, under President Elias Harawi and Prime Minister Rafic Hariri, turned to the private sector, reconstructing the nation through private investment and growing national debt. But such foundations were not stable. Lebanon was still a tinderbox, and a single spark could send the country plunging back into crisis. In 2005, that spark came with the assassination of Rafic Hariri. Syrian troops had pledged to withdraw from Lebanon following the end of the war in 1990, and they had complied, at least to an extent. Syria had stayed on in the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon, and 15 years later, there they remained. But Damascus's influence was not restricted to Bekaa. Syrian troops and authorities had a habit of making a nuisance of themselves wherever they went, using fear and intimidation on the local population, seemingly with impunity. Faisal Itani, writing for New Lines magazine in 2023, recalls an incident that took place when he was at university in Beirut. Faisal's friend, irritated by another road user acting erratically, raised his middle finger to the other driver. He hadn't seen the Syrian registration plates on the car and had no idea that this was part of a convoy carrying Bashar al-Assad's own cousin. He was dragged from his vehicle and beaten unconscious with a Syrian rifle butt for his trouble. In another incident, a Syrian convoy plowed into Faisal's own car at a junction in Beirut, causing significant damage. A nearby Lebanese policeman helped Faisal to calm down and told him the matter wasn't worth pursuing, and the culprit simply drove away. They likely saved Faisal some serious trouble. These are just two incidents, but they do offer some insight into the general atmosphere between Lebanese citizens and the Syrians in the early years of the new millennium. The murder of Rafic Hariri brought these tensions ahead. While Hezbollah's militants would later be convicted of Hariri's killing, much of the initial finger-pointing had been aimed at Damascus. In April 2005, only 2 months after Hariri's death, Syria bowed to the pressure from demonstrators in Lebanon. Syrian troops finally withdrew, almost 3 decades after they'd first arrived. The Cedar Revolution, as it became known, brought together many of the characters that had directed the course of the Civil War a decade and a half before. The Jamal family, Jajai family, Walid Jumblat, Saad Hariri, son of Rafiq, all had disagreed and even fought against one another in the conflict, but were now united. They, along with the United States, Saudi Arabia, 10 European countries, and roughly 1 million civilian protesters, wanted the Syrians out. Freedom, sovereignty, independence was one of the mantras voiced by the protesters. They got their wish, at least temporarily. A notable absentee from the protest was Hezbollah. Despite their previous opposition to Syria, particularly in the final years of the Civil War, Hezbollah were now staunch advocates of Bashar al-Assad and his Damascus government. With the Syrians now gone, Hezbollah risked becoming even more isolated on the Lebanese political stage. They opted to take steps to change this. Always a thorn in the side of their Israeli enemies to the south, Hezbollah stepped up their activities in 2005 and 2006. In July 2006, militants captured 2 Israeli soldiers and killed 8 others. Israel, which had only withdrawn its troops from Lebanon 6 years before, invaded again. As Israeli troops drove deep into southern Lebanon, air and sea units implemented a blockade. The newly reconstructed Beirut was once again in the line of fire as Israel shattered what they believed to be Hezbollah bunkers in the capital with highly explosive airstrikes. For just over a month, the war raged in Lebanon. Hezbollah's best-case scenario, it appeared, would be a Pyrrhic victory for Israel. Estimates suggest there were never more than 1,000 Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon at any point in the conflict, while Israel's forces peaked at 30,000. There was only ever going to be one winner, and even with nominal support from Iran, that was never going to be Hezbollah. Around 1,300 people lost their lives in the 36-day conflict. Of these, around 121 were Israeli soldiers, and between 250 and 600 were Hezbollah fighters. Most of the remaining casualties were civilians, 44 Israelis and up to 1,000 Lebanese. Once again, conflict had claimed huge numbers of innocent victims. In a grim sense, Hezbollah had achieved its aims. They'd inflicted damage on Israel, and they'd sown the seeds of domestic and international opposition to Ehud Olmert and his government in Tel Aviv. As expected, this had come at an enormous cost, but it had brought armed struggle back into the Lebanese conversation. Hezbollah would be back on the offensive less than 2 years later, clashing with government supporters in Beirut and elsewhere across the country. Around 100 people were killed in a week of disorder in May 2008. Again, Hezbollah got what it wanted. With another civil war now a very real possibility, Lebanese ministers were brought to the table, forming a national unity government of 30 members. In this new legislative structure, Hezbollah now have a voice and a vote. Almost immediately, this became a problem for the government. When Saad Hariri, son of the slain Rafic Hariri, was sworn in as prime minister in 2009, Hezbollah lodged their veto. It took 5 months to break the deadlock, and Saad eventually formed his government in November. But Hezbollah were growing stronger, both politically and militarily. In January 2011, their strength pushed the national unity government to breaking point. By June of the same year, a new government was formed with Hezbollah in the driving seat. When the UN attempted to prosecute members of Hezbollah for the murder of Rafic Hariri, the militant group blocked their arrest. That same year, the Arab Spring protests tore through the Middle East and North Africa. Lebanon, which had ongoing troubles of its own, was largely untouched by the mass demonstrations, but Syria was not. From March 2011 onwards, a series of protests and crackdowns brought Syria to the brink of civil war and put the al-Assad regime in jeopardy. While Syria and Iran had essentially fought a proxy war in Lebanon in the late 1980s, the toppling of the al-Assad government was not acceptable to Tehran. They supplied weapons to Damascus, while Hezbollah sent fighters over the border to join the struggle. Lebanon was again embroiled in a regional conflict, and this had an impact at home too. Pro- and anti-Syrian groups clashed in Beirut and Tripoli throughout 2012, leaving many people dead. In October 2012, Lebanese security chief Wissam al-Hassan was killed in a car bombing, with some accusing Syria of having a hand in the attack. The ongoing crisis in Syria would shape the next few years of Lebanese history. Hezbollah, still in control of the government, stepped up its commitment to al-Assad, sending more troops, more weapons, and more money to fight the rebels. Coming the other way, an increasingly large number of refugees. By the end of 2012, 160,000 refugees had entered Lebanon from Syria. By the summer of 2016, the number was more than 1 million. Lebanon found itself under pressure on multiple fronts. Terror attacks increased in the country, often claiming multiple lives. Some blamed Lebanon's ongoing involvement in Syria for this, others simply blamed the refugees. After Israeli airstrikes killed Hezbollah fighters in Syria, Hezbollah's militants launched border raids into Israel yet again, destabilizing the south of the country and instigating more bloodshed. Across the country, clashes between gunmen and government forces flared. Syrian rebels even succeeded in taking towns along the eastern border, at least temporarily, including the town of Arsal in 2014. And then there was the economy. Years of economic stagnation and spiraling national debt had left Lebanon in a precarious position. Amid accusations of corruption, Saad Hariri, who had returned to the role of prime minister for a second term, was forced to step down in January 2020. Hassan Diab, a Hezbollah-backed academic, took his place, but did little to halt the economic decline. With Lebanon's currency now plummeting in value, Diab found he had another, more insidious enemy to deal with: COVID-19. Forcing an already discontented populace into lockdown essentially spelled the end for the Diab regime, only a few months after it had gained power. When a devastating explosion destroyed Beirut's port, an industrial accident this time rather than an act of war, the subsequent rioting led Diab to quit. The briefest glimmer of hope following the end of the Civil War had died away as the pressure of economic disaster and perpetual conflict squeezed the life out of the Second Republic. COVID-19 and ensuing government restrictions ravaged the world, hobbling economies and killing hundreds of thousands. For countries like Lebanon, already reeling from decades of hardship, it was just too much to bear. What is a failed state? We might define this as a state in which the government can no longer perform its basic functions and fulfill its fundamental responsibilities. So, is Lebanon a failed state? In a 2023 report for PBS, journalist Layla Molana Allen certainly seemed to suggest so. She described a country in which people have learned to adapt to no electricity, no petrol, no medicine. A country in which the basic essentials are denied. Najat Aoun Saliba, a member of the Lebanese parliament and one of the 12 independent MPs challenging the status quo in Lebanon, described how the country had slipped back into the warlord economy of decades ago. The warlords know how to shut people up, she said. They have stripped us of everything, even of our dignity, and we keep begging those warlords for services, not for our rights. With a government unable to provide for its people and with regional control shifting back into the hands of whoever has the most men and the most guns in any particular area, the situation in Lebanon is not good. It certainly fits most definitions of the term failed state. Against this grim backdrop, some Lebanese citizens are taking matters into their own hands. Rather than forming militias of their own and contributing to the endless cycle of violence, they're forming NGOs and charitable organizations. They are supporting lives rather than taking them. One of these people is Maya Ibrahimcha. As the founder of Bet El Baraka, or House of Blessings, Maya is working to support Lebanon's aging population, offering them the care, support, and hope they need to live fulfilling lives for as long as possible. Lebanon's population is aging faster than any other across the Middle East and North Africa. As of 2023, 11% of Lebanese citizens are aged 65 and above. As Maya says, 80% of our senior population lives with absolutely no safety net. Ever since the economic crisis started, many elders are literally sleeping on the streets because their children are no longer able to take care of them. Maya is just one person among a large number of Lebanese citizens working hard to make a positive difference. But this work is a symptom of Lebanon's ongoing disease rather than a cure. The fact that Maya and others like her are in such high demand is further evidence that the government is simply unable to provide for its people. However, such stories do offer hope. After decades of warfare and bloodshed, and after economic collapse and financial mismanagement left so many people essentially penniless, the light of humanity still burns brightly. There are still individuals, like Maya and like Najat, who refuse to give in to despair and tyranny. It will be these individuals who, when the time comes, and it will come, lead Lebanon and her people toward the lights at the end of the tunnel. Thanks for joining us on this in-depth and often harrowing look at the rise and fall of the Lebanese Republic. This is not a story with a neat and tidy ending. Lebanon's torment has not yet ended. All we can do is try bring you up to date with Lebanon's ongoing story and try to shed some light on what got us here. And with this hopeful conclusion, perhaps we can end things on a positive note. But what do you think? What lies in store for Lebanon in the coming years? How will the Israeli-Hamas conflict impact Lebanon? If you're Lebanese, let us know your experience in the comments section below, and I hope our video today has done justice to the history of your country thus far.